In the spring of 1944, the sea was calm more often than it was not. From the concrete observation slit of a bunker overlooking the Norman coastline, a German infantry officer could watch the channel for hours without seeing anything at all. The water shifted with the tide. Fishing boats moved in the distance. Gulls circled and settled. The horizon remained unchanged. Everyone understood that this quiet would not last. By early 1944, the German High Command had accepted what had once been speculation. The Western Allies would return to the continent. Britain had become a staging ground. American troops had arrived in numbers that could no longer be concealed. Somewhere along the Atlantic Wall, the invasion would come. The question was where. The officer stationed near the French village above the beaches of Normandy had been transferred there months earlier. His orders were precise and repetitive. Inspect defensive positions, supervise artillery readiness, coordinate with neighboring units, and ensure that the men remained prepared at all times. The routine did not change with the weather. Each morning began before sunrise. The bunkers, poured in reinforced concrete and embedded into the dunes, held the cold even in late spring. Lamps flickered against thick walls that muffled the sound of wind. Maps were unfolded on wooden tables. Range markers were reviewed. Ammunition counts were recorded carefully, in pencil, in narrow columns. The Atlantic Wall, as it was called, stretched from Norway to the Spanish border. It was not a single wall, but a system: bunkers, artillery batteries, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and steel hedgehogs planted into the sand. It had been designed to make any landing costly. On paper, the system appeared formidable. Along this particular sector of coastline, heavy guns were positioned to cover the beaches with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun nests were concealed behind camouflaged embrasures. Barbed wire ran across the upper edges of the sand. Wooden stakes had been driven into the tidal flats, angled to damage landing craft during high tide. The officer knew each position personally. He had walked the beach in winter storms to inspect obstacles that the sea had dislodged. He had spoken with engineers who complained about shortages of concrete and steel. He had signed reports requesting reinforcement that might or might not arrive. There was confidence in the fortifications, but it was not absolute. Air raids had become more frequent in the months before June. Allied bombers crossed the coast at high altitude, targeting rail lines, bridges, and supply depots inland. The ground trembled occasionally, even when the bombs fell miles away. Communications cables were sometimes severed. Repair crews worked quickly, but not invisibly. The officer understood that the Atlantic Wall did not stand alone. Its success depended on rapid reinforcement. Panzer divisions were positioned further inland, intended to counterattack any landing before it could expand. But those units required clear orders and unobstructed movement. Air superiority was no longer Germany's. In conversations with fellow officers, speculation remained measured. Some believed the main landing would occur near Calais, the shortest distance across the Channel. Others argued that Normandy's broad beaches made it equally vulnerable. Intelligence reports were contradictory. Deception, they assumed, would be part of any Allied plan. For the soldiers stationed in bunkers, however, strategy mattered less than readiness. The men rotated through observation shifts in pairs. One watched through binoculars while the other logged notes. Fishing vessels were identified and dismissed. Occasional reconnaissance aircraft appeared high above the clouds. At night, flares sometimes illuminated the water briefly before fading. The officer made it a point to visit each position without warning. He inspected machine gun belts for corrosion. He asked gunners to recite firing ranges from memory. He reminded younger soldiers to conserve energy, to sleep when permitted, and to write letters home when the opportunity arose. Many of the men under his command were not veterans of the Eastern Front. Some were older reservists. Others were very young. Their understanding of the coming invasion was abstract. They knew it would be large. They did not know how large. On calm evenings, the coastline appeared almost peaceful. French civilians moved quietly in nearby villages. Farmers continued their routines in fields beyond the dunes. The occupation had become, for many, a fact of daily life rather than an immediate confrontation. Yet beneath the routine, anticipation accumulated. In staff briefings, phrases repeated themselves: heightened alert, Possible airborne operations. Naval concentrations reported. None of these reports specified a date. The uncertainty stretched across weeks, then months. The officer found that waiting demanded its own discipline. He learned the patterns of the tide with precision. High tide would lift landing craft over certain obstacles, low tide would expose them. He reviewed charts showing gradients of sand and the likely points of disembarkation. Artillery coordinates were checked and rechecked. There were moments when false alarms spread along the coast. A radar contact would be misinterpreted. Distant engine noise would prompt a temporary alert. Men rushed to positions, only to stand down hours later. Each incident left behind a residue of tension, though no one described it that way. The Atlantic Wall, despite its name, did not eliminate uncertainty. It organized it. In late May, inspections intensified. Senior officers visited coastal sectors more frequently. Defensive exercises were conducted at night. Telephone lines were tested. Reserve ammunition was redistributed closer to primary gun emplacements. The officer sensed a shift, though no official announcement marked it. Orders were delivered with slightly greater urgency. Leaves were cancelled. Equipment that had remained in storage was brought into immediate readiness. Still, the sea remained unchanged. From the bunker's narrow opening, the horizon offered no indication of scale or intention. It was impossible to imagine thousands of ships occupying that line where sky met water. And yet, reports suggested precisely that across the channel, preparations were reaching completion. The officer wrote in his logbook with careful handwriting. Weather conditions. Visibility. Personnel status. Ammunition inventory. Each entry resembled the last. The act of recording created the impression of stability. At night, when the bunker settled into relative quiet, he sometimes considered the simplicity of his task. Hold the position. Maintain readiness. Respond to orders. The instructions were clear, even if their timing was not. In early June, the weather shifted. Winds increased across the channel. Rain moved in from the west. Patrols along the beach became more difficult. Some believed that poor weather reduced the likelihood of invasion. Others argued that unpredictability might offer concealment. On the evening of June 5, reports of increased aerial activity circulated along the coast. Radar stations detected movement over the channel. Communications were active but incomplete. No definitive confirmation arrived. Inside the bunker, the officer reviewed maps one final time before midnight. He checked the readiness of the gun crews and instructed them to rest in shifts. The men moved with familiarity, not panic. Outside, beyond the dunes, the sea. Chapter 2. The Weight of Defensive Preparation. Complication. By early June 1944, the Atlantic Wall was no longer an abstract project discussed in Berlin briefings. It had become a lived environment. For the German officer stationed along the Norman coast, preparation was not an idea. It was concrete under his boots, steel in the sand, and daily reports that accumulated without pause. The coastline had been reshaped over months of labor. Yet the more complete the defenses appeared, the more their limitations became visible. The bunkers were engineered to endure naval bombardment. Reinforced concrete walls reached several meters in thickness. Firing slits were angled to minimize exposure. Ventilation shafts were protected against shrapnel. Inside, however, the air was heavy, and the space was narrow. Equipment was arranged with precision because there was no room for error. Artillery positions were mapped carefully to overlap with neighboring sectors. Each gun had a designated arc of fire. Range tables were posted beside the breech mechanisms. The officer insisted that every gun crew memorize their coordinates. In theory, any landing craft entering the sector would be caught in crossfire before reaching the sand. In practice, much depended on timing and communication. Telephone lines connected bunkers to command posts inland. These cables ran through trenches and beneath roads, vulnerable to bombardment. Radio sets were available, but they were not immune to interference. The officer understood that the strength of the defensive system rested on uninterrupted coordination. Inspections consumed his days. He walked the length of the sector with engineers and non-commissioned officers. Wooden stakes had been driven into the tidal flats at calculated angles, designed to pierce the hulls of landing craft during high tide. Mines were buried at intervals along the upper beach. Anti-tank obstacles were positioned where vehicles might attempt to move inland. Each element had a purpose. Each element required maintenance. Winter storms had dislodged some obstacles and shifted sand over others. Repair teams worked between air raids. Supplies of cement and steel were limited. Requests for additional materials moved through bureaucratic channels that did not always respond quickly. The officer recorded these deficiencies without exaggeration. His reports were factual. Several minefields incomplete. 2 machine gun nests awaiting replacement parts. Ammunition stocks adequate but not abundant. Above the coastline, Allied aircraft passed more frequently. The sound of engines became familiar. Bombs fell inland, targeting rail networks and bridges that would be essential for German reinforcements. Smoke could sometimes be seen rising far beyond the dunes. The officer recognized the pattern. The Atlantic Wall was designed to hold an invasion at the shoreline until mobile reserves could arrive. But if transportation routes were severed, those reserves would move slowly, if at all. This was not a dramatic realization. It was a logistical one. Within the bunker, the men adjusted to prolonged readiness. Helmets rested beside bunks. Rifles were kept within arm's reach. Night exercises were conducted without warning to ensure rapid response. The officer rotated shifts carefully, aware that fatigue could erode discipline more effectively than bombardment. He avoided language of certainty when addressing his men. Instead, he emphasized procedure. If the alarm sounds, report immediately to your assigned position. Check ammunition belts before dawn. Confirm communication lines at each shift change. The simplicity of the instructions reinforced stability. Occasionally, higher-ranking officers visited the sector. Staff cars arrived along narrow coastal roads. Questions were asked about morale, ammunition, and observation patterns. The Atlantic Wall was presented in official language as a formidable barrier. Yet even during these inspections, attention lingered on weaknesses, incomplete obstacles, uneven terrain, aging equipment. The officer did not interpret these visits as criticism. They reflected the scale of the challenge. The coastline stretched for thousands of kilometers. No single sector could be reinforced beyond available resources. Intelligence briefings offered limited clarity. Reports suggested that Allied forces were assembling in southern England in significant numbers. Reconnaissance photographs indicated concentrations of ships in British ports. Yet deception operations were suspected. Calais remained a plausible target. For those stationed in Normandy, speculation changed nothing. The officer found that preparation had a cumulative weight. Every added minefield increased responsibility. Every reinforced bunker represented expectation. The defensive system had grown complex, and complexity demanded precision. In late May, new directives arrived emphasizing immediate response to airborne landings. Rumors of paratrooper operations circulated among officers. The possibility that an invasion might begin inland, behind the beaches, introduced another variable. Anti-glider poles were erected in open fields. Patrols were expanded during nighttime hours. Coordination with nearby infantry units intensified. Maps were updated to include potential drop zones. The officer considered these adjustments carefully. The Atlantic Wall faced the sea, but the threat might arrive from the sky. Weather reports were studied with unusual attention. Wind direction, cloud cover, and tide cycles were charted. A landing required favorable conditions. Too much wind could disrupt naval coordination. Too little moonlight might hinder airborne troops. The officer did not attempt to predict the date of invasion. Instead, he focused on readiness within his control. On the evening of June 4th, a storm moved across the channel. Rain lashed against bunker walls. Waves struck the shore with force. Some men speculated that no invasion could occur under such conditions. Others remained silent. The officer reviewed tide tables again. He understood that poor weather might delay operations, but it could also conceal movement. Inside the bunker, equipment was cleaned and reassembled. Ammunition crates were opened and inspected for moisture damage. Telephone lines were tested twice in a single shift. The repetition of these actions did not create tension. It reinforced routine. Yet beneath the routine, a structural complication had taken shape. The Atlantic Wall was strong at fixed points, but it could not move. Its effectiveness depended on timing, reinforcement, and uninterrupted communication. If any of those elements faltered, the system would strain. The officer sensed this not as doubt, but as awareness. On June 5, aerial activity intensified after nightfall. Reports filtered through neighboring sectors of increased movement over the channel. Some radar stations registered unusual patterns. Messages arrived, were relayed, and sometimes contradicted each other. No formal confirmation declared that the invasion had begun. The officer ordered heightened alert status nonetheless. Men were instructed to remain near firing positions. Sleep would be taken in short intervals. Observation posts were doubled. Beyond the dunes, the sea was obscured by darkness. The defensive preparations, built over months, stood ready. Concrete, steel, mines, and artillery formed a barrier shaped by engineering and expectation. Yet the barrier awaited activation. Its strength could only be measured in response to an event that had not yet fully materialized. Chapter 3, June 6, 1944, Inside the Bunkers. Escalation. Shortly after midnight, the first reports arrived not from the sea, but from inland. Telephone lines carried fragmented messages from units positioned beyond the beaches. Parachutes had been sighted against the night sky. Gunfire was reported near crossroads and bridges. Some messages were clear. Others were incomplete, cut off before confirmation. Inside the bunker overlooking the Norman coast, the officer listened without interruption. He wrote down each report in measured handwriting. Airborne landings had been anticipated. Their purpose was understood: disrupt communications, delay reinforcements, create confusion before a seaborne assault. The sea, however, remained dark. Shortly before dawn, the sound began. At first it was indistinct, like distant thunder beyond the horizon. The officer stepped to the observation slit and adjusted his binoculars. The early light was thin, filtered through low clouds. Gradually, shapes emerged along the line where sky met water. They were too numerous to count. Ships extended across the horizon in both directions. Large vessels stood further out. Smaller craft moved steadily toward shore. The formation did not appear hurried. It advanced with controlled, deliberate motion. The officer lowered his binoculars and turned to the men inside the bunker. "Prepare for engagement." There was no raised voice. No abrupt movement. Each crew member moved to his assigned station. Artillery crews checked elevation settings. Machine gunners positioned belts into feeding trays. Telephone operators confirmed contact with adjacent positions. Moments later, the first naval shell struck. The bunker trembled under impact. Concrete absorbed the force, but dust drifted from the ceiling. The sound was continuous, not singular. Explosions landed across the defensive sector, some near artillery positions, others further inland. The officer steadied himself against the wall and listened for damage reports. One gun position reported minor structural cracks but remained operational. Another line went silent, likely severed by bombardment. Naval fire continued for what felt longer than it measured. Outside, obstacles along the beach were struck and splintered. Smoke rose from multiple points along the dunes. Then, through gaps in the bombardment, smaller shapes advanced toward shore. Landing craft. They approached in staggered lines, cutting through the waves despite surf and shellfire. Some were struck before reaching the beach. Others altered course slightly, adjusting to currents and debris. The officer gave the order to open fire. Artillery pieces discharged in controlled rhythm. Recoil mechanisms absorbed force and reset. Shells landed among the approaching craft. Machine guns joined the pattern, tracing lines across the water where ramps would soon lower. From inside the bunker, the view was narrow. The officer could see only what the firing slit allowed: a segment of beach, a stretch of surf, fragments of movement. The landing craft began to reach shallow water. Ramps dropped. Figures moved forward under sustained fire. Some fell immediately. Others advanced, using obstacles for partial cover. Engineers attempted to clear mines and stakes despite incoming rounds. The officer did not observe the entire beach. He observed a section. Within that section, the exchange was intense and continuous. Telephone communication grew irregular. One neighboring bunker reported heavy damage and requested support. Another confirmed continued firing but indicated limited visibility due to smoke. Overhead, Allied aircraft passed in low arcs. Their engines were audible even within the reinforced concrete. Strafing runs targeted exposed gun positions and supply points behind the dunes. The officer requested confirmation of reserve movements. The response was delayed. Airborne activity inland had disrupted road access. Some units were attempting to regroup. Others awaited authorization to move. Within the bunker, ammunition belts were replaced methodically. Artillery shells were brought forward from storage racks. The men worked without visible panic. Training governed their actions. Hours passed, though time inside the bunker felt compressed. The tide shifted gradually, exposing more of the beach. Obstacles became visible where water had receded. Some landing craft lay disabled in the surf. Others had successfully delivered infantry who now pressed inland, seeking exits from the beach. The officer noted a change in the pattern of fire. Allied naval bombardment decreased in frequency, replaced by more targeted strikes against identified strongpoints. It suggested that observers offshore were adjusting to German positions. By mid-morning, reports indicated that several beach sectors had been breached. Not overrun entirely, but penetrated in specific areas. Communication from inland units remained inconsistent. Paratroopers had secured certain crossroads, complicating reinforcement routes. Inside the bunker, conditions grew heavier. Air circulated slowly through filtered vents. The sound of continuous firing strained concentration. Yet procedures remained intact. The officer stepped again to the observation slit. The scale of the invasion was no longer theoretical. Ships continued to unload men and equipment. Additional waves approached in steady intervals. Smoke drifted across the shoreline, partially obscuring the horizon. He understood that what he witnessed was not a raid, nor a probing attack. It was sustained commitment. Shortly before noon, a direct hit struck near the bunker's exterior wall. The impact shook the interior violently. One crew member was thrown against a support beam, injured but conscious. Equipment shifted from its brackets. Dust thickened in the confined space. Structural integrity held. The officer ordered a brief assessment of damage. Firing resumed within minutes. Outside, Allied forces established footholds beyond the initial line of obstacles. Movement inland became more coordinated. Signals could be seen between advancing units. Engineers cleared paths through minefields with deliberate persistence. The officer requested updated orders from command. The reply, when it arrived, instructed all coastal positions to hold at maximum capacity. Reinforcements were being assembled. Counterattacks would be organized once clarity improved. Clarity did not improve quickly. Air superiority limited German movement in daylight. Roads remained under observation from above. Units attempting to approach the beaches reported delays and casualties. By early afternoon, the officer's world had narrowed further. His responsibilities centered on maintaining operational capacity within a structure increasingly isolated by smoke and disrupted communication. The escalation was not sudden. It accumulated. Each new wave of landing craft reinforced the permanence of the operation. Each damaged communication line reduced coordination. Each hour reduced the likelihood that the invasion could be repelled at the shoreline alone. Inside the bunker, the men continued their assigned roles. Artillery fired. Machine guns cycled. Reports were logged, even when incomplete. The officer maintained posture and tone. He did not speculate aloud about outcomes. Through the narrow slit of reinforced concrete, the coastline that had been watched for months had transformed. It was no longer a line of anticipation. It was an active battlefield. And the Atlantic Wall, built in preparation, was now fully engaged.
Chapter 4. The shift inland turning point by mid-afternoon on June 6th. The character of the battle had changed from inside the bunker. The officer could still hear artillery and small arms fire along the shoreline.
Smoke continued to drift
across the beach, rising in uneven columns where obstacles burned or vehicles lay disabled.
Yet the pattern of sound was no longer concentrated at the water's edge. IT was moving inland. Reports that had arrived throughout the morning now formed
a clearer picture.
Allied forces had secured multiple footholds. Engineers had opened passages through minefields. Infantry units were advancing beyond the first line of defenses.
The Atlantic Wall had not collapsed in a single moment. It had been bypassed in sections. The officer stood over the map table and traced the marked positions with his finger.
Defensive sectors once connected by telephone lines were now isolated. Some bunkers remained operational but cut off from coordinated support.
Others had fallen silent entirely. He requested confirmation of reserve movements once more. The answer, when it came, was measured but unambiguous.
Counterattacks were being organized, but delays were unavoidable.
Airborne landings had disrupted key intersections. Allied aircraft dominated the roads.
Movement in daylight exposed columns to immediate attack. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to hold the beaches until armored divisions could drive the enemy back into the sea.
That sequence depended on speed.
By afternoon, speed had been compromised. Inside the bunker, ammunition supplies were reduced but not exhausted.
The men rotated positions carefully to preserve strength.
Casualties within the immediate sector were fewer than expected, largely due to the protection of reinforced concrete. Yet the officer understood that survival within a bunker did not equate to success across the coastline. He returned to the observation slit. Through lingering smoke, he could see Allied units consolidating positions beyond the dunes. Movement
inland appeared deliberate rather than chaotic.
Vehicles once limited to the shoreline began to advance where terrain permitted.
Signals passed between formations with increasing coordination. The officer considered the defensive doctrine that had governed their preparations. Hold the shoreline, deny landing, prevent expansion. The first objective had been partially achieved. In certain sectors,
the second had not. A new set of orders arrived in late afternoon. Coastal units were instructed to maintain resistance where possible, but prepare for potential withdrawal to secondary positions if encirclement became imminent.
The language was restrained. It did not describe defeat. It described adaptation. The officer gathered his non-commissioned officers and relayed the directive without embellishment. We will continue to hold until further notice. If communications, seas and inland movement becomes unavoidable, we will regroup at the designated secondary line. There was no protest,
no visible relief. The men acknowledged the adjustment as they had acknowledged previous instructions. Outside, the battle extended beyond sight of the bunker's narrow view.
Inland villages reported engagement. Fields that had been quiet farmland in the morning now carried the movement of advancing troops and retreating units.
Roads that once linked defensive sectors had become contested ground. The officer felt the shift not as panic, but as narrowing possibility. The Atlantic Wall, once perceived as a barrier stretching uninterrupted along the coast, had become a series
of isolated strongpoints. Each bunker could continue firing. Each gun could still function, but the continuity between them had weakened. As evening approached, naval bombardment lessened in frequency. Allied forces had established sufficient
positions ashore to rely more heavily on ground operations.
Occasional shells still struck coastal defenses, but the intensity of the morning had passed. The officer ordered a status assessment. 2 adjacent bunkers had ceased responding entirely. Another reported low ammunition and structural damage. Inland,
infantry units were engaged in sustained combat near road junctions. Reinforcements were still expected, but the scale of the invasion had altered calculations.
What had begun as a defensive stand at the waterline had expanded into a broader campaign across Normandy. He stepped outside the bunker briefly under cover of fading light. The beach bore visible marks of the day's engagement. Destroyed landing. Craft rested at angles in the surf. Sections of obstacle fields were cleared or shattered. Bodies lay where they had fallen, both German and Allied.
Smoke thinned gradually as wind shifted. The officer did not remain outside long.
Air activity, though reduced, had not disappeared. Back inside, he reviewed contingency plans prepared weeks earlier.
Secondary defensive lines had been identified inland, utilizing hedgerows and elevated terrain. These positions lacked the reinforced
protection of coastal bunkers, but offered tactical depth. The realization settled with quiet clarity. The decisive moment had passed. The invasion had not been repelled at the shoreline. The conflict would now move beyond fixed fortifications into a prolonged struggle across fields and villages. As darkness approached, intermittent gunfire continued inland. Flares illuminated portions of the horizon where fighting persisted.
Communications were sporadic but functional enough to maintain coordination within surviving sectors. The officer addressed his men once more. "We will maintain readiness through the night.
Orders may change quickly.
Remain prepared." The tone remained steady. There was no dramatic declaration.
Only acknowledgement that the nature of their task had evolved. The Atlantic Wall had represented preparation and anticipation. Its concrete walls symbolized permanence, yet permanence depended on context.
Once the enemy secured ground beyond its reach, the wall became a starting point rather than a boundary. Inside the bunker, lamps cast muted light against reinforced surfaces.
Maps remained spread across the table, now marked with revised front
lines. The officer added new annotations in careful script. He did not describe the day as failure.
He recorded it as transition. The coastline that had been watched for months had fulfilled its role as the first line of defense.
Now, the war in the West had re-entered France in force.
The responsibility of those inside bunkers would shift from
holding a barrier to participating in a wider, uncertain campaign. Outside, the tide began to recede once more, indifferent to the structures built along its edge. The turning point had not arrived as a single collapse. It had arrived as a steady movement inland measured in kilometers rather than moments, reshaping the purpose of every bunker along the coast.
As the first hours of June 7, 1944 unfolded, the officer and his men faced the immediate consequences of the previous day's invasion. The shoreline, once a carefully prepared network of concrete, steel, and mines, now bore the visible marks of engagement. Destroyed landing craft lay scattered along the surf, twisted metal caught in sand and debris. Sections of obstacles had been cleared or broken apart. Smoke drifted from smoldering positions, carrying the scent of oil, gunpowder, and burned wood inland. Inside the bunker, the officer conducted a systematic assessment.
Equipment that had survived the bombardment and initial engagement was organized.
Ammunition stocks were counted and redistributed.
Men who were unharmed resumed observation, keeping watch over the changing landscape beyond the dunes.
Injured personnel received treatment in improvised first aid areas, their wounds a quiet reminder of the day's cost.
Though the immediate crisis had subsided, tension remained an unspoken acknowledgement that the invasion's impact would extend far beyond the coastline. Reports continued to arrive sporadically from neighboring sectors.
Some positions had maintained partial contact, but several bunkers remained isolated or silenced entirely. The officer noted patterns carefully, recognizing the fragmentation of what had once been a continuous defensive line.
Coordination had
been tested beyond its design.
The Atlantic Wall, formidable in concept, had proven vulnerable when confronted with simultaneous aerial, naval, and ground operations. Outside, Allied forces consolidated their footholds. Engineers and infantry moved inland, clearing obstacles, establishing secure positions, and preparing for further operations.
From the officer's vantage point, the landscape appeared both chaotic and methodical, men moving with intent amid
the residual damage of the previous day. He recorded these movements with clinical precision, documenting each observed advance or retreat, each altered formation, without embellishment.
This was not a narrative of heroism or defeat. It was a record of circumstance, observation, and consequence within the bunker. Reflection accompanied the routine of preparation.
The officer considered the lessons embedded in the events of June.
6. The Atlantic Wall had delayed, disrupted, and inflicted casualties. It had been the result of months of planning, engineering, and disciplined execution. Yet the wall's static nature, combined with the speed and coordination of Allied forces, revealed inherent limitations. It could not operate in isolation,
nor could it guarantee outcomes. Its strength lay in preparedness.
Its weakness lay in inflexibility against a dynamic assault. In quiet moments, the officer walked through the bunkers, observing men as they cleaned weapons, inspected positions, or rested briefly. Each individual carried the weight of responsibility,
discipline, and uncertainty.
Their experiences were bounded by the orders they had received, the structures that protected them, and the consequences of choices made above and below ground. The officer recognized that the human dimension, decision-making, endurance, and adherence to protocol was as critical as concrete and steel. As evening fell on June 7th, reports indicated a stabilization of certain sectors, while fighting continued.
In villages and along secondary lines, the immediate pressure on the bunkers had eased. Reinforcements were beginning to maneuver where possible, and some communication lines were restored.
The officer documented these developments methodically, acknowledging incremental successes and persistent challenges. There was no triumphalism. There was clarity. Outside, the coastline retained scars from the conflict, craters, debris, and altered terrain. Yet even amid destruction, the officer observed signs of life and continuity. Birds returned to the dunes, wind shifted the sand, and distant figures moved with cautious purpose. These natural rhythms, indifferent to human struggle, underscored the inevitability of change and the persistence of the environment beyond human control. In the reflection that followed, the officer understood the broader significance of June 6. The invasion was no longer a hypothetical scenario. It had materialized in both scale and consequence. It had challenged assumptions, tested preparation, and reshaped the operational landscape. The Atlantic Wall remained, but its role had shifted from an impenetrable barrier to a segment of a larger theater of war, now engaged in dynamic, continuous operations that extended inland. He returned to the map table one final time that evening.
lines were redrawn, sectors marked with new priorities, and contingencies noted for the hours and days to follow.
The officer wrote concise summaries in his logbook, emphasizing observable facts over conjecture, positions held, obstacles cleared,
Communications functional or disrupted, units operational or compromised. The act of recording became a form of discipline and understanding, framing events in a manner that could guide decisions in an uncertain future. As darkness deepened, the officer stood at the observation slit once more.
The coastline, long watched and meticulously fortified, had been tested in the most direct manner possible. Its defenses had shaped the course of engagement, yet they had not dictated the outcome entirely. Beyond the line of sand and obstacles, the landscape of Normandy now hosted a new chapter of conflict, one defined by mobility, coordination, and the enduring unpredictability of war. In the quiet that followed the day's intensity, the officer
recognized a persistent truth: preparation and vigilance, though essential, were part of a continuum, not a conclusion.
Each moment of engagement, each decision, each measured response contributed to the unfolding course of events. The Atlantic
War had fulfilled its intended function, but it was only one element in a far larger narrative.
Its legacy would be measured not solely by resistance, but by the clarity it afforded those within it to act decisively, respond to change, and understand the evolving reality of conflict. June 6, 1944, would remain a defining point in the officer's memory, not as a day of victory or defeat, but as the moment when anticipation became action, when preparation met execution, and when the inevitability of consequence shaped the lives of those standing behind concrete walls, observing the horizon, and participating in a history far larger than any single individual or structure. The resolution was not absolute. It
was reflective, inevitable, and human, leaving the officer and his men to confront both the tangible aftermath and the broader implications for the campaign still unfolding inland.